It's the real news. I'm Maté. May 15th is the culmination of the Great March of Return, where for weeks now, Palestinians have been marching on the Gaza fence, calling for their basic rights, an end to the Israeli blockade, and the right of return to the homes from which they were expelled in 1948. Israel has fired on these protests every single week, killing at least 40 Palestinians and injuring thousands more. And here with me to discuss is Norman Finkelstein. He is the author of many books, including his latest, Gaza, an Inquest into its Martyrdom. Norman, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So talk about what's at stake with the final stage of the Great March of Return.
Well, I think the most important thing is to put the march in its historic context. 70 years ago, this coming May 15th, began the expulsion of Palestinians from what became the State of Israel. And so the beginning of the process, which is culminating this week, was the creation of the Palestinian refugee question. And 70% of the population of Gaza constituted by refugees and their children, who are also classified as refugees under the UN system. So the beginning of the process is expulsion. And a half century ago, Gaza came under Israeli occupation. And it was from the very beginning a very brutal occupation. The worst massacres were presided over at the time by Ariel Sharon. So now you have expulsion. On top of that, you have occupation. And then beginning in 2006, you have the siege of Gaza, the blockade, after Hamas won the parliamentary elections. Israel, followed by the US and the EU, imposed a medieval-like siege, a blockade of Gaza, which an illegal, immoral, inhuman siege of Gaza. And then you have the expulsion, the occupation, the blockade, and then on top of that, you have these periodic massacres visited on Gaza. Since 2004, there have been not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, not six, not seven, eight massacres visited on the people of Gaza. Now, when I say the people of Gaza, you have to bear in mind more than half the population are children. They're under the age of 18. So when we're talking about an inhuman blockade, when we're talking about massacres, they're being visited predominantly on children. Well, you can imagine, it's not difficult to conceive, that when you have this process of expulsion, occupation, blockade, massacre, at some point the place becomes unlivable. I don't mean unlivable in some sort of poetic sense. We're talking about physically. The UN consists mostly of bureaucrats, very dry bureaucrats. And they put out, on the other hand, they put out quite competent reports. And beginning in 2012, they were asking a very realistic question. Will Gaza be livable in 2020? Again, physically, biologically, medically, will it be livable? It began with a question. Then in 2015, a UN agency, UNCTAD, put out a report, and it no longer had it as a question. It said on the present trajectory, Gaza will be unlivable in 2020. And then in 2017, the UN realized it had been overly sanguine, overly optimistic. They said that Gaza has crossed the threshold of unlivability a long time ago. Now, what does that mean practically? It means that, for example, 97% of the water in Gaza is contaminated. Every American should understand that. We had our own national outcry when the water in Flint was discovered. Well, now we're talking about a whole area. Gaza, the water is contaminated. As Sarah Roy of Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies put it in the newest edition of her standard work on Gaza's economy. Roy is the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy. She said, innocent people, mostly children, are being poisoned by the water they drink and by the food they eat, because the soil is also contaminated. So we have a situation where people are now confronted by the fact that they are, and this makes, one doesn't like to make comparisons, because then you kind of get into this comparative suffering, and nobody really wants to go down that road. But there are aspects of Gaza that are unique. And one of the aspects is, as the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, put it, they said UNRWA is the main humanitarian organization working with Palestinian refugees. They said, everywhere else in the world, if there's a natural disaster, say a drought, or a human-made disaster, such as war in Syria, they said it's not a great option, but people can flee. They can leave. They can move. Now, I'm not the last one to pretend that's a great option, to become a refugee, in many cases ending up in a tent in mud. But the people of Gaza don't have that option, says UNRWA. They're trapped. Now, you have to ask yourself a very simple question. What word would you use to describe a situation where 2 million people are trapped in an area that's physically unlivable? That's not my language. That's the language of the UN. They're physically trapped in an area which is unlivable, and in which, to quote Sarah Roy, they're being poisoned. So, faced with that reality, the people of Gaza saw no option, because the option of using armed resistance, which was attempted several times, proved futile. They were unable to get Israel to budge at all. As a last resort, the people of Gaza organized really en masse, grassroots, non-sectarian, to try to break through the siege using nonviolent civil resistance.
And so Gazans have done what many people across the world have been claiming that they want Gazans to do over many years, which is to non-violently protest. They've been marching every single week. Children, women, normal residents of Gaza. What has been the Israeli response?
Well, the Israeli response has been, to quote Amnesty International in a recent report it issued on the situation in Gaza, they said that Israel's conducting, and I'm quoting them, Israel's conducting a murderous assault on nonviolent protesters in Gaza. It was very unusual for Amnesty. I've followed Amnesty very closely over many years. They've never used an expression like murderous assault. And even Natalie Portman, very unusual, the actress Natalie Portman, she was Alan Dershowitz's research assistant for his book, The Case for Israel. So she was pretty far over on the right-wing end of the spectrum. And she described what Israel is doing in Gaza as committing atrocities in Gaza. So the language has itself crossed a certain threshold from pretty respectable language like disproportionate force and indiscriminate force, Now the language is finally, it took a long time, but it's rising to the occasion of the brutality of the Israeli response. The interesting question, or an interesting question, is why? In part, obviously, Israel is unleashing this murderous assault on overwhelmingly nonviolent protesters to try to repress it. But there is another side. The other side is, as one of the senior Israeli officials put it in a WikiLeaks, they said, we don't do Gandhi well. And what they meant by that was, they always have a very big problem with Palestinians engaged in nonviolent resistance, because when they use or resort to their usual brutal force, it doesn't look good in the international media. And so they're constantly trying to provoke the Gazans into resorting again to armed force. That's why they're targeting the children. That's why they're targeting beloved journalists like Murtaji, because they want to enrage the Gazans. That's why they killed the Palestinian in Malaysia, the engineer. They're hoping he was close to Hamas. They're hoping to trigger a reaction.
There was an assassination of a Palestinian man in Malaysia.
Right, a Palestinian engineer. Then they killed the six, they don't acknowledge it, but everybody knows. They killed the six Qassam Brigade militants a few days ago in Gaza.
Qassam Brigade is the armed wing of
Hamas. Just as they killed the 6 Hamas militants on November 4th, 2008, to provoke a Hamas attack, a rocket attack, so they'll have a pretext.
November 4th, 2008, by the way, which was the election of Barack Obama.
Yes.
So the world attention was on that.
Yeah.
Which is a good segue, a good way to.
And that's what they're trying, and that's part of the reason they're targeting them. They're desperately trying to evoke a reaction so they can come in the full force of their brutality and claim it's self-defense. I'd just like to say, it's reached such a shameless level of ridiculousness that as Hamas holds back, as Islamic Jihadi holds back,
Islamic Jihad, another militant group inside Gaza,
as they absorb all the brutal, vicious Israeli provocations, the New York Times weighs in and it says that the Palestinians in Gaza are posing a lethal threat to Israel. Kites. They say that the Palestinians are flying kites which are somehow going to burn down Israel. Because Hamas refuses to fire the quote-unquote rockets, which are not even rockets, so they don't have that pretext. So the Israeli propagandists on the New York Times, like Isabel Kirshner, so now they've conjured a new pretext. These kites, which they say are going to burn Israel to the ground. They're so desperate to try to justify the tactics and the provocations of the state of Israel.
All right, so we'll pause there and we'll pick this up in part 2. My guest is Norman Finkelstein, author of many books, including Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom.